Priya Sharma never imagined that her fairy tale would turn into the worst nightmare of her life in a matter of hours. At 26, she had achieved everything a young Indian woman could dream of. A degree in business administration from the University of Mumbai, a promising job at a German multinational, and, most importantly, the love of Thomas Weber, a 32-year-old German engineer she had met during a business conference in Frankfurt. Priya and Thomas's love story seemed straight out of a romantic movie. He, a tall, blonde, blue-eyed man, was immediately fascinated by the young Indian woman's exotic beauty and sharp intelligence. She, in turn, saw in him not only a romantic partner, but a gateway to a completely new life in Europe, far from the suffocating expectations of her traditional family in Delhi. The relationship blossomed quickly. Thomas visited India 3 times in 2 years, charming Priya's family with his genuine interest in the local culture and his efforts to learn a few words of Hindi. Priya's parents, initially skeptical about the intercultural relationship, were gradually won over by Thomas's serious intentions and financial stability. For them, the marriage represented not only their daughter's happiness, but an opportunity for social advancement that few in their community had experienced. The marriage proposal took place in December 2023, during Priya's 3rd Christmas in Germany. Thomas had planned everything down to the smallest detail. A romantic dinner at a restaurant overlooking the Rhine in Cologne, followed by a walk through the Christmas market where he knelt in the snow and offered her a diamond ring that had cost him 3 months' salary. Priya said yes through her tears, while German tourists applauded around them. Wedding preparations began immediately. Priya's family insisted on a traditional Hindu ceremony in Delhi, followed by a Western celebration in Paris, which Thomas had chosen as the most romantic place in the world to begin their honeymoon. It was complex and costly logistics, but both families were willing to make sacrifices to make everything perfect. In the months leading up to the wedding, Thomas showed an unusual interest in the details of Priya's past life. He asked specific questions about her previous relationships, her college friends, and even her social life in Mumbai. At first, Priya interpreted this curiosity as a sign of his deep love for her. After all, he wanted to know every aspect of her life in order to love her completely. But there was something about Thomas's questions that began to bother Priya. He seemed particularly interested in a specific period of her life, the 2 years she had spent working in Mumbai before moving to Germany. When she mentioned co-workers or social events from that time, Thomas would tense up and ask more questions, always with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. Priya tried to broach the subject a few times, asking why he was so interested in her past, but Thomas always deflected, saying he was just trying to better understand the woman he was about to marry. She began to realize that he had researched her on social media much more thoroughly than he had initially admitted. Old photos she had forgotten, comments on posts from friends from years ago, everything seemed familiar to him. The Hindu ceremony in Delhi was spectacular. 3 days of traditional festivities, with hundreds of guests, abundant food, and music that lasted until the wee hours. Thomas participated in all the rituals with apparent enthusiasm, wearing traditional attire and following the instructions of the Hindu priests. The photos showed a radiant couple surrounded by the love of 2 families that had been united across the ocean. But Priya noticed some strange moments during the celebration. Several times she caught Thomas discreetly photographing or filming specific guests, always when he thought no one was looking. When questioned, he said he was just documenting the cultural experience to show his German friends. However, she noticed that he paid special attention when former colleagues from Mumbai came to greet her. The flight to Paris took place the day after the festivities in Delhi ended. Both were exhausted but excited about the prospect of the second part of their wedding celebration. The Hôtel Le Meurice on Rue de Rivoli had been chosen by Thomas for its classic elegance and prime location. The presidential suite offered a spectacular view of the Tuileries garden, and Priya felt like a princess as she entered the luxurious surroundings. The Western party was scheduled to take place in the hotel's main hall, with 50 guests from Germany, some close friends of Priya's who had flown in from India especially for the occasion, and even some distant relatives of Thomas's who lived in France. It would be a more intimate celebration than the Indian ceremony, but no less important to the couple. The afternoon before the party, while Priya was resting in her room after a manicure and pedicure at the hotel spa, Thomas left, saying he needed to take care of some last-minute details with the event organizer. He seemed more nervous than usual, constantly checking his cell phone and avoiding her gaze when he spoke. Priya took advantage of her husband's absence to call her best friend, Meera, who had stayed in Mumbai. During the conversation, Meera mentioned something that made Priya's blood run cold. In recent days, some former co-workers had approached her asking for specific details about her personal life in Mumbai, claiming that a German journalist was researching a story about Indian professionals working in Europe. The questions, according to Meera, were very specific and included details about relationships, social life, and even financial aspects of the period when Priya worked at the multinational company. Even more worrying, the alleged journalist seemed to know intimate details about Priya's life that only those very close to her knew. As she listened to Meera, Priya felt a chill in her stomach. The pieces of a sinister puzzle began to fall into place in her mind. Thomas's insistent questions about her past, his strange behavior during the wedding in Delhi, and now this mysterious investigation into her life in Mumbai. What exactly had Thomas discovered about her? And more importantly, what did he intend to do with this information? When Thomas returned to the room 2 hours later, Priya was sitting in the armchair by the window, still wearing her spa robe, but with a completely different expression on her face. He immediately noticed that something had changed, but tried to maintain normality by commenting on the party preparations and making plans for dinner. But Priya could no longer pretend that everything was fine. For the first time since they had met, she looked at Thomas and saw a stranger. The man she had loved and married had turned into something threatening, someone who had invaded her privacy and investigated her past obsessively and secretly. The question hammering in her head was simple but terrifying. What else did he know about her that she didn't know he knew? Thomas entered the room with a different expression on his face. The forced smile he had maintained all day finally disappeared, replaced by something much more sinister. He locked the door behind him and walked slowly to where Priya was sitting, stopping only when he was standing directly in front of her. "We need to talk," he said, his voice laden with a coldness she had never heard before. "About Mumbai, about Vikram Malhotra, about what you really did in those 2 years before you moved to Germany." The name hit Priya like a punch in the stomach. Vikram Malhotra was a chapter of her life she had buried deep, something that belonged to a past she had literally run away from to the other side of the world. How had Thomas found out about Vikram? And more importantly, what exactly did he know about that dark period of her life? "I don't know what you're talking about," she lied, but her voice trembled in a way that betrayed the panic she was feeling. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in his laughter. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and began swiping through the screen, looking for something specific. When he found it, he turned the device so she could see. It was an old photo from 2021, taken at a corporate party in Mumbai. Priya was in the background of the image, chatting animatedly with a well-dressed, attractive middle-aged man. Vikram. This photo was posted on Instagram by a former colleague of yours, Rohini Das, I believe. She was very helpful when I explained that I was doing a surprise for my future wife, documenting her past life as a wedding gift. People are so naive when you make up a romantic story. Priya felt her hands tremble. Rohini had been a close friend at the time, someone she trusted. The idea that Thomas had manipulated people from her past to get information about her was terrifying. "Rohini told me some very interesting things about you and dear Vikram," Thomas continued, now pacing back and forth in front of her like a prosecutor during a trial. "How you became his protégé very quickly after being hired. How you suddenly had access to confidential company information. How you started wearing expensive clothes and jewelry that definitely didn't match your trainee salary." Each word was like a blade, cutting through the carefully constructed defenses Priya had erected around that period of her life. She tried to speak, to deny, to explain, but Thomas raised his hand to silence her. But the most interesting part was when Rohini told me about the scandal, about how Vikram Malhotra, married for 20 years and father of 2, was found dead in his apartment. About how the initial investigation suggested suicide, but then it turned out that several fraudulent contracts had been signed using his identity. About how a significant amount of money had disappeared from the company's account. And about how you, dear Priya, simply disappeared from the city 2 weeks later, claiming to have gotten a job in Germany. The room spun around Priya. Thomas had found out everything. Not just her relationship with Vikram, but also her connection to his death and the missing money. For 2 years, she had lived a completely new life in Germany, convincing herself that she had left everything behind. Now, on the eve of her wedding party in Paris, her past had returned to haunt her in a way she could never have imagined. "The question is, my dear wife, did you kill Vikram Malhotra because of the money you stole together, or did you kill him because he was going to report you to the police?" Thomas was now sitting on the bed, studying Priya's face with the cold curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen. She realized that he had been planning this moment for months, perhaps even since the beginning of their relationship. The whole love story, the interest in Indian culture, the romantic marriage proposals, it had all been an elaborate trap to get to this very moment. "Thomas, you don't understand," she began, her voice almost a whisper. "Vikram he wasn't who you think he was. He threatened me, blackmailed me. I was trying to get out of that situation when you killed him," Thomas finished. "Yes, I figured that would be your version of the story. The innocent victim who was forced to defend herself. Very convenient." Priya realized there was nothing she could say to change his mind. Thomas had already decided she was guilty, and more than that, he had engineered their entire relationship based on that conviction. But why? What did he intend to do with this information? "The real question," Thomas said, standing up again and walking over to the window, "is what I'm going to do with this knowledge. You see, I could just call the German police right now. I'm sure they'd be very interested to know that a fugitive from Indian justice has been living illegally in Germany for 2 years, using forged documents to obtain a work visa." Priya swallowed hard. Thomas wasn't just emotionally blackmailing her. He had concrete evidence that could completely destroy her life in Europe. Deportation would be the least of her problems if the authorities found out about Vikram. "But I'm a reasonable man," Thomas continued, turning to face her again, "and it just so happens that I have a proposal for you, one that could be mutually beneficial for both of us." Thomas's phone rang, interrupting the tense moment. He glanced at the screen and smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen on his face that afternoon. "Ah, perfect timing. This is Klaus, my business partner. He's arriving at the hotel now for our meeting before the party. You remember him, don't you? I've mentioned him a few times. He's, let's say, someone with very useful connections in several countries, including India." Priya felt the blood freeze in her veins. Thomas's mutually beneficial proposal was starting to become clear, and she realized that her situation was much worse than she had imagined. Her husband wasn't just an obsessed man who had discovered her dark past. He was someone who intended to use that knowledge for some specific, calculated purpose. When Klaus knocked on the door 15 minutes later, Priya was still sitting in the same armchair, paralyzed by the magnitude of the situation she found herself in. Thomas opened the door and warmly greeted a short, middle-aged man with grey hair and small eyes that immediately fixed on Priya with disturbing intensity. "So this is the famous bride," Klaus said in English with a thick German accent. "She's even more beautiful than in the photos, Thomas. You've done an excellent job." Klaus's words confirmed Priya's worst fears. Whatever Thomas was planning, Klaus had been involved from the beginning. And from his words, she wasn't a wife, she was a product. Klaus sat down in the chair opposite Priya, studying her with the eyes of someone accustomed to evaluating merchandise. Thomas poured whiskey for both of them, acting as if they were having a normal business meeting, not discussing the future of a terrified woman who had just discovered that her marriage was an elaborate sham. "Explain to her how it works," Klaus said to Thomas, taking a tablet out of the leather briefcase he had brought with him. "It's best that she understands completely before the party starts." Thomas sat down on the edge of the bed, assuming the posture of someone about to give a corporate presentation. The coldness with which he spoke contrasted sharply with the caring man Priya thought she knew. "You see, Priya, over the past 18 months, Klaus and I have developed a very lucrative business. We identify young, attractive women with complicated pasts. Women who, for various reasons, cannot turn to the authorities when they find themselves in difficult situations." Klaus unlocked his tablet and began swiping through the screen, showing photos of at least a dozen different women. All were young, beautiful, and clearly of different nationalities, some Asian, others Eastern European, one who appeared to be Middle Eastern. "Our clients are very wealthy men with very specific tastes," Klaus continued, his voice laden with cold pragmatism. "They pay extremely high prices for exclusive company, especially when that company has specific physical and cultural characteristics that they cannot easily find in Europe." Priya felt nausea rising in her throat. What they were describing was human trafficking, and she was being groomed to become the next victim. But there was something even more sinister in the way they spoke, something that suggested their plan went beyond simply selling her. "The difference in our business model," Thomas said, "is that we don't kidnap anyone. We create situations where the victim cooperates voluntarily, at least initially. Marriage is the perfect tool, legal, romantic. It creates emotional bonds that can be exploited." Klaus showed more images on the tablet, official documents, marriage certificates, visas. "Once the marriage is official, we have significant legal control, especially when the woman is in a foreign country without a support network and with legal issues in her home country." The brutal truth of the situation hit Priya like an avalanche. They hadn't chosen her at random. Thomas had specifically identified her because of her vulnerability, an immigrant with a criminal past, isolated from family and friends, desperately dependent on her legal status in Germany. "But you're making a mistake," Priya said, finding courage she didn't know she had. "I didn't kill Vikram Malhotra, and you have no real evidence that I committed any crime." Klaus and Thomas exchanged a look she couldn't quite interpret, but there was something about it that made her realize her statement had struck a nerve. "Interesting that you mention that," Klaus said, turning his attention back to the tablet. "Because in fact, we know exactly what happened to Vikram Malhotra, and we know why you really can't go to the police." He turned the tablet so she could see the screen. It was a surveillance video, clearly low quality, showing the hallway of an apartment building. The date in the corner indicated that it was recorded in September 2021. "This video was obtained through unofficial channels," Klaus explained. "It shows you entering Vikram's apartment on the night he died. But more interestingly, it shows you leaving 40 minutes later, carrying a suitcase that you definitely didn't have when you arrived. Priya felt the world spin around her. The video existed, real evidence of her presence in Vikram's apartment on the night of his death. Even if she could explain the circumstances, even if she could prove it was self-defense, the existence of the video meant that her version of events would never be accepted without a full investigation that would reveal everything. The suitcase contained money, Thomas continued. $300,000 that Vikram had withdrawn from corporate accounts in the days leading up to his death. Money that you brought with you to Germany and used to establish your new life. You don't understand, Priya said, her voice breaking. Vikram was blackmailing me. He said he would ruin my career if I didn't continue sleeping with him. The money was compensation for what he did to me. Perhaps, Klaus said, closing the tablet. But that's an explanation you'll have to give to an Indian jury, assuming, of course, that you survived the extradition process and the years in Indian prison awaiting trial. The threat was crystal clear. They weren't just blackmailing her with the possibility of exposure. They had physical evidence that could result in her conviction for murder, regardless of the actual circumstances. So here's our proposal, Thomas said, taking back control of the conversation. You can cooperate with us. Show up at the party tonight, smile for the photos, consummate our marriage. Then tomorrow, you come with us to meet some very special clients who are eager to make your acquaintance. You will be well treated, well fed, and receive a percentage of the payments. And if I refuse, the video and all documents related to Vikram Malhotra's death will be handed over to the German and Indian authorities tomorrow morning. You will be arrested, extradited, and likely spend the rest of your life in an Indian prison for murder and theft. Klaus stood up, putting the tablet away in his briefcase. The choice is yours, but it must be made now. The party starts in 2 hours and our first clients arrive in Paris tomorrow. Priya looked at the two men who had systematically destroyed her life and realized there was no real escape. They had engineered the situation so that whatever choice she made would lead to her destruction. The only difference was whether that destruction would be immediate and legal or gradual and under their control. If I agree, she said finally, how do I know you'll keep your word? How do I know you won't kill me as soon as I'm no longer useful? Thomas smiled, but there was cruelty in his expression. Because, my dear, dead women don't make money. You're worth much more to us alive and cooperative than dead and useless. Klaus opened the door, preparing to leave. You have 15 minutes to make your decision. After that, I will assume you have chosen the police option. When the door closed behind them, Priya finally collapsed. Tears she had held back throughout the conversation finally began to run down her face. She was trapped in an impossible situation, created by men who had studied every aspect of her vulnerability and exploited every weakness. But as she cried, a part of her mind began to work. Thomas and Klaus had made one crucial mistake. They had assumed she was completely defenseless. They didn't know that Priya had survived on the streets of Mumbai before getting her first job, or that she had learned to defend herself when necessary. More importantly, they didn't know about the small dagger she always carried, hidden in her purse, a reminder of the dangerous days of her youth. If she had to attend the party, perhaps she could find an opportunity to turn the tables. After all, they had underestimated her once, when they assumed she would be a passive victim. Perhaps it was time to remind them that the woman who had survived the streets of Mumbai would not give up without a fight. The main hall of the Hotel Le Meurice had been transformed into a fairy tale setting. White and gold flowers decorated each table, candles created a romantic atmosphere, and guests chatted animatedly as they awaited the couple's entrance. To any outside observer, it was the perfect celebration of true love. No one could have imagined that the bride was being forced to play the role of her life while desperately plotting her escape. Priya stood in front of the bedroom mirror, wearing the white and gold silk sari she had chosen months ago, when she still believed this would be the happiest day of her life. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the traditional Indian jewelry, gifts from her family that now seemed like golden chains, binding her to an impossible situation. Thomas knocked on the door and entered without waiting for permission. He looked impeccable in his black tuxedo, with a white flower in his lapel, looking like the perfect picture of a happy groom. But his cold eyes betrayed his true intentions. "It's time," he said, offering his arm gallantly. "Remember, honey, smile for the cameras. Our guests are eager to see how radiant with happiness you are." As they descended into the hall, Priya mentally catalogued each person present. There were approximately 50 guests, most of them Thomas's acquaintances from Germany. She recognized some of his co-workers, neighbors, and even a few distant relatives, but she also noticed faces she didn't remember seeing before. Older, well-dressed men who watched the party with unusual interest. "The observers there," Thomas whispered in her ear, "are investors in our business. They want to see the quality of our product for themselves before placing future orders." The nausea Priya had felt in the bedroom returned with full force. Not only was she being forced to participate in her own sham wedding, but she was being displayed as merchandise to potential buyers. The symbolic Western ceremony was brief but torturous. Priya recited the vows she had written weeks ago when she still believed the words she was saying. Each promise of eternal love and fidelity turned to ashes in her mouth, especially when she saw Klaus standing at the back of the hall, filming everything with his phone. During dinner, Priya was introduced to Thomas's investors. They were middle-aged to elderly men, all extremely wealthy by the standards of their clothes and jewelry. They spoke to her politely but appraisingly, commenting on her beauty, her education, and her docility. One of them, a burly Arab named Rashid, was particularly blunt. "She will be perfect for my client in Dubai," he said to Thomas, as if Priya were not there. "He has a specific preference for educated Indian women. When can we arrange the transfer?" "Patience, my friend," Thomas replied. "First, we need to ensure that our bride is completely committed to the arrangement. Tomorrow morning, we will have a final conversation about logistics." Throughout the conversation, Priya kept a forced smile on her face, but her right hand rested on the small handbag where the dagger was hidden. She had made a decision during the preparations. She would not leave that hotel alive if it meant becoming a sex slave to these men. The hours passed in a blur of forced toasts, obligatory dances, and superficial conversations with guests who had no idea of the real situation. Priya noticed that several of the legitimate guests began to leave around 11 o'clock at night, leaving only the inner circle of Thomas, Klaus, and the investors. It was then that Klaus approached her with 2 glasses of champagne. "To the radiant bride," he said, offering one of the glasses, "a special toast to mark this memorable occasion." Priya accepted the glass, but did not drink immediately. There was something about the way Klaus was watching her that awakened all her survival instincts. She pretended to drink, but kept the liquid on her lips without swallowing. "Drink," Klaus insisted, his voice carrying a veiled threat. "It's important to celebrate properly." That's when Priya realized the champagne was drugged. They planned to sedate her to make what came next easier. Her mind raced, trying to find a way to get rid of the drink without raising suspicion. "Of course," she said, raising her glass as if to make a toast. "But first, let me make a proper toast to my wonderful husband." She turned to Thomas, who was talking to Rashid a few feet away. "Thomas, dear, come here. I want to make a special toast to you." When Thomas approached, smiling condescendingly, Priya raised her glass in the air. "To the man who completely changed my life," she said, her voice laden with an irony that only she could perceive. "Who showed me who I really am and what I'm capable of." And then, in a quick, fluid motion that surprised everyone, she threw the contents of the glass in Thomas's face and ran toward the hall exit. But Klaus had anticipated the possibility of escape. Two large men Priya hadn't noticed before immediately blocked the main doors. She turned, looking for another exit, but realized she was trapped. "We really hoped you would be more cooperative," Thomas said, wiping the champagne from his face with a napkin. His mask of cordiality had finally fallen completely. "But if you want to make this difficult, we can accommodate that desire." Klaus signaled to the security guards, who began to slowly approach Priya. That was when she made her final decision. If they wanted to take her, they would have to fight for it. Priya quickly opened her purse and pulled out the small dagger, holding it up so that everyone could see it. The metal glinted in the hall lights, and the look on her face made it clear that she was willing to use it. "Stay where you are," she said, her voice firm for the first time in hours. "I'm not leaving this hotel with you. If you try to force me, I swear that at least one of you won't leave here alive." Rashid laughed, clearly amused by the situation. "A kitten with claws. That will make things more interesting." But Thomas wasn't amused. He had underestimated Priya, and now he realized he had a much more complicated situation on his hands. If she made a public scene, if she hurt someone or screamed for help, the entire carefully orchestrated plan would fall apart. "Priya, be reasonable," he said, trying to regain his controlled tone. "You know you have nowhere to go. Even if you escape from this room, even if you leave the hotel, we still have the video. Your life will still be ruined." "Maybe," she replied, keeping the dagger pointed at him, "but at least it will be my own choice, not your sick plans." It was at this moment of maximum tension that something unexpected happened. Klaus's phone rang, and when he answered it, his expression changed dramatically. He spoke quickly in German, then hung up and whispered something urgent in Thomas's ear. Thomas paled visibly. "We have a problem," he said to the group. "The French police are in the hotel lobby. Apparently, someone made an anonymous report about suspicious activity." Priya felt a wave of hope. Maybe someone had noticed what was going on, or maybe it was just a coincidence. But regardless of the reason, the arrival of the police completely changed the dynamics of the situation. "If the police come up here and find you holding a knife," Klaus said to Priya, "who do you think they'll believe? We have 50 witnesses that you attacked your husband at your wedding party." But Priya had already thought of that. "And I have a very interesting story to tell them about human trafficking and blackmail," she replied. "I'm sure they'll be fascinated to hear about your investors and your plans for tomorrow." The situation had become a dangerous stalemate. Priya was armed and desperate. Thomas and Klaus were exposed with the arrival of the police, and the investors were beginning to realize that they had gotten involved in something that could result in public scandal and imprisonment. It was Rashid who broke the tense silence. "I didn't sign up for this kind of drama," he said, heading for a side exit that Priya hadn't noticed. "Find a way to resolve this, or our deal is off." As the other investors followed Rashid out of the hall, Priya realized there was only one way out of this situation alive. She had to bet everything on one last, desperate move. The sound of heavy footsteps echoing down the hotel hallway broke the tense silence in the hall. The French police were coming up, and Priya knew she had only minutes before the situation became even more complicated. With the dagger still in her hand, she made the decision that would change everything. "Klaus, Thomas," she said, her voice taking on an authority that surprised even herself. "You have a choice now. You can try to stop me and explain to the police why a bride is armed at her own wedding party, or you can let me leave here now and maybe still come up with a story that will save you." Thomas laughed, but it was a nervous, desperate laugh. Do you really think you'll be able to get out of here? Even if you escape the police now, we still have the video from Mumbai. Your life will still be ruined. That was when Priya played her final card. During all the time she had spent terrified in the room, a part of her mind had been working on a desperate plan. Now it was time to put it into action. Actually, Thomas, you made a fatal mistake, she said, pulling her cell phone out of her purse with her free hand. While you were explaining the whole criminal scheme, I was recording everything. Every word about human trafficking, every name of the investors, every detail about how you operate. It's all here, on this phone. The expression on Klaus's face changed completely. You're bluffing! Priya tapped the phone screen, and Thomas's voice began to come out of the speaker. Our clients are very wealthy men with very specific tastes. They pay extremely high prices for exclusive company. Thomas moved toward her, but Priya raised the dagger in a defensive position. One more step, and I'll scream for help. I'm sure the police will be very interested to hear why the groom is attacking his armed bride. It was at this crucial moment that the doors to the hall opened, but instead of the French police, the person who entered was someone Priya never expected to see again. Meera, her best friend from Mumbai, accompanied by a man in a dark suit who was clearly not a guest at the party. "Priya!" Meera shouted, running toward her friend. "Thank God you're okay. This is Inspector Dubois from Interpol. I told him everything." Thomas and Klaus's world collapsed in a matter of seconds. Inspector Dubois showed his ID and immediately took control of the situation. "Messrs. Weber and Richter," he said in English with a French accent, "you are under arrest on suspicion of international human trafficking and blackmail. We have been investigating your activities for several months." Klaus tried to run for the side exit, but two other Interpol officers entered the hall at that very moment, blocking his escape. Thomas stood frozen, clearly trying to process how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Priya lowered the dagger, finally allowing herself to believe that the situation was under control. But Meera quickly embraced her and whispered in her ear, "It's not over yet. There are things you need to know." Inspector Dubois approached Priya. "Madame Sharma, I must inform you that we also have matters to discuss regarding Mumbai. But first, I need you to help us with information about these men's operation." It was then that Thomas made his last desperate move. Realizing he was lost, he shouted at Inspector Dubois, "She's a murderer. This woman killed a man in Mumbai and ran off with $300,000. I have proof." Inspector Dubois didn't seem surprised. "Yes, Mr. Weber, we are aware of the Vikram Malhotra case. In fact, that's why we're here." Priya felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. If Interpol already knew about Vikram, if they had come to get her, everything was lost after all. But Meera held her hand tightly. "Priya, listen to me. After you left for Germany, Vikram's family hired private investigators. They discovered things about him that changed everything." Inspector Dubois opened a folder and took out several documents. "Madam Sharma, Mr. Vikram Malhotra was being investigated by several agencies for financial crimes and sexual blackmail of employees. What you experienced with him was not an isolated case. There were at least 6 other women he was blackmailing simultaneously." Priya could barely process the information. "But the video, I was there the night he died." "Yes, you were," confirmed Inspector Dubois. "But the investigation revealed that Vikram Malhotra died of an accidental overdose of heart medication mixed with alcohol. He was trying to simulate a heart attack to emotionally blackmail you, but he miscalculated the dosage." Meera continued, "The investigators uncovered his entire system. He secretly recorded intimate encounters, forged financial documents to incriminate women, and used everything for blackmail. The money you took was actually rightfully yours. It was payment your company owed you, but he had embezzled it." Thomas exploded. "That's impossible. I checked everything. The video shows her leaving with the suitcase. Inspector Dubois turned to Thomas with a cold expression. The video you obtained through criminal channels, Mr. Weber, shows a woman recovering money that had been stolen from her by a sexual predator. It does not show a crime. It shows a victim finally escaping. The irony of the situation hit Priya like a tsunami. For 2 years, she had lived with guilt and fear for something that was not a crime at all. Vikram had died because of his own greed and incompetence, not because of any action on her part. And Thomas had built his entire elaborate scheme based on a false premise. Klaus, handcuffed and being led away by the officers, shouted one last threat. "This isn't over. We have people waiting for her in 3 different countries. You can't protect her forever." But Inspector Dubois just smiled. "Actually, Mr. Richter, your investors are already being arrested in simultaneous operations in Dubai, Frankfurt and London. This investigation has involved multiple international agencies for 8 months." Priya finally understood. "You knew about their plan from the beginning." "Not exactly," Inspector Dubois admitted. "We were investigating the trafficking ring, but we didn't know specifically about you until your friend Mira contacted us 2 weeks ago. She was concerned because strange people were asking questions about you in Mumbai." Mira took Priya's hand. "I knew something was wrong when that supposed journalist started asking very specific questions. So I started my own investigation and discovered that the journalist was actually Klaus. When I traced his connection to Thomas, I realized you were in danger." "But how did you end up in Paris?" "We intercepted communications between Thomas and Klaus about tonight's party," explained Inspector Dubois. "We knew something was going to happen here, but we weren't sure what. The anonymous tip at the hotel was our strategy to create pressure and force them to make mistakes." Thomas, handcuffed and defeated, made one last attempt at negotiation. "I can give you names, locations, bank accounts, the entire operation in exchange for immunity." Inspector Dubois shook his head. "Mr. Weber, we already have all that information. Your operation wasn't as secret as you thought." As Thomas and Klaus were led out of the hall, Priya finally collapsed into a chair, the dagger falling from her trembling hand. The adrenaline that had sustained her for hours finally dissipated, leaving her exhausted and emotionally drained. Mira sat down beside her. "It's over, Priya. Really over. You're free." But Priya knew it wouldn't be that simple. Even though she wasn't a criminal, even though Vikram had died by his own actions, she still had to completely rebuild her life. Her marriage was a sham, her trust was shattered, and she would have to testify in multiple international trials. Inspector Dubois approached again. "Madame Sharma, I know this is a lot to process, but I will need you to come with us to give your official statement. We will also arrange protection for you over the next few months until all members of this network are brought to justice." Priya looked around the destroyed hall with wilted flowers, extinguished candles, and the wreckage of what should have been the happiest day of her life. But for the first time in 2 years, she breathed truly free. "Inspector," she said, rising with new determination, "I am ready to tell everything. It's time to make sure these men can never do this to any other woman again." 6 months later, Priya was sitting in a quiet cafe in Berlin, watching the snow fall gently on the street as she reviewed the manuscript on her laptop. The book she was writing about her experience had already attracted interest from 3 German and 2 Indian publishers. Her story had become a symbol of survival and resistance against international human trafficking. Life after that night at the Hotel Le Meurice had been an emotional roller coaster of rebuilding, court testimony, and psychological healing. The first few months were the hardest. Priya had to live under police protection while she testified in 5 different countries, helping to completely dismantle Thomas and Klaus's network. The trial of Thomas Weber and Klaus Richter had ended just 2 weeks earlier. Thomas was sentenced to 15 years in prison for human trafficking, blackmail, and international conspiracy. Klaus received 18 years, being considered the mastermind of the operation. Both would also face additional charges in the United Arab Emirates, where Rashid and other investors were cooperating with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences. During the trial, the full extent of the criminal operation emerged. Thomas and Klaus had married at least 12 different women over the past 3 years, using false identities and elaborate stories. Some of the victims were never found, presumably sold to even more sinister networks in the Middle East and Southeast Asia. Priya had to testify not only about her own experience, but also help identify other possible victims through seized photos and documents. What impacted her most during the process was discovering how many other women had gone through the same experience as her. Women from different countries, all with similar vulnerabilities, legal problems in their home countries, social isolation, emotional dependence. The pattern was always the same: obsessive investigation of the past, emotional blackmail, marriage as a tool of control, and finally the attempt to sell them into prostitution rings. 3 of the other surviving victims testified alongside Priya. Anastasia, a 24-year-old Ukrainian who had married Klaus using a false identity. Elena, a Romanian who had been sold to a sheikh in the Emirates and managed to escape with the help of consulate officials, and Chen Wei, a Chinese woman who had been married to an associate of Thomas in Frankfurt before being rescued in a police operation. The stories were all terribly similar, but also inspiring. Each of them had found the strength to resist, to survive, and ultimately to help justice prevail. Together, they formed a support network that extended far beyond the courtrooms. During the months of the trial, Priya also had to deal with the full revelation of the truth about Vikram Malhotra. The Interpol investigation had uncovered documents proving that Vikram had systematically blackmailed at least 20 women over 5 years. He had developed an elaborate system of secret recordings, forged documents, and psychological manipulation that destroyed careers and lives. Vikram's family, initially hostile to Priya, eventually sought her out to apologize. His younger brother Arjun came to Berlin in person to meet with her. "We didn't know," he said, tears streaming down his face. "We thought Vikram was just a successful workaholic. Finding out what he did, how he hurt you and so many other women, it destroyed our family. Our mother still can't accept the truth." Priya had found peace in forgiving Vikram's family. They were victims too, in a different way. The brother they knew and loved had never really existed. He was just a mask over a systematic predator. The most surprising aspect of the whole experience was discovering her own strength. For years, Priya had seen herself as a victim, someone who had fled Mumbai, carrying guilt and shame. But the process of confronting Thomas and Klaus, of testifying in court, and of helping other victims find justice had revealed a resilience she didn't know she possessed. Mira had temporarily moved to Berlin to support Priya during the most difficult months. Their friendship had deepened through the ordeal, and now they were planning to start an NGO to help women in similar situations. "Do you realize," Mira said one afternoon as they reviewed funding proposals, "that your story could save hundreds of other women? What you went through, as terrible as it was, can serve as a warning and an inspiration." It was this realization that had motivated Priya to write the book, not just to process her own experience, but to educate other women about the warning signs, about how predators like Thomas operate, and about how to find the strength to resist, even in the most desperate circumstances. She had also become an active speaker at conferences on human trafficking and migrant women's safety. Her story had been presented at the UN, at Interpol conferences, and at universities across Europe. Each time she spoke, she saw faces in the audience, Young women who might be at risk, professionals who work with victims, policymakers who could implement systemic change. The most rewarding aspect was receiving letters and emails from women who had recognized signs of danger in their own relationships after hearing her story. A young Romanian woman wrote that she had broken off an engagement after realizing that her German boyfriend was asking very specific questions about her past and legal status. An Indian student in London sought help after realizing she was being emotionally blackmailed by a professor. Professionally, Priya had completely rebuilt her life. Her investigative experience during the Thomas Klaus case had sparked her interest in forensic work. She was pursuing a master's degree in criminology at Humboldt University, focusing on transnational crime. Her thesis would be on recruitment methods used by human trafficking networks, based on her personal experience and the cases she had helped investigate. Personally, healing had been more complex. Priya was still in weekly therapy, working through the trauma of having been so completely manipulated by someone she had trusted. The concept of romantic trust was something she was still carefully rebuilding, but there was progress. A few weeks earlier, she had started dating David, a fellow master's student who worked for Doctors Without Borders. He knew her whole story, had read the newspaper articles, but treated her simply as Priya, not as a victim, not as a brave survivor, just as an intelligent and interesting woman who was building a meaningful life. "The hardest part," she had said to David during one of their first dates, "is learning to trust my own instincts again. Thomas was so convincing, so manipulative, that I question my own perception of people." "Maybe," David had replied, "the issue isn't learning to trust perfectly again, but learning to trust gradually, with healthy boundaries and lots of open communication." This perspective had helped Priya understand that healing did not mean returning to her pre-trauma state, but building a new version of herself that incorporated the lessons she had learned in a positive way. As she closed her laptop in the Berlin cafe, Priya reflected on the title she had chosen for her book, "The Bride Who Never Was: How I Survived a Human Trafficking Trap." It was simultaneously about loss and discovery, about vulnerability and strength, about how the worst moments of our lives can sometimes reveal aspects of ourselves we never knew existed. Her phone rang. It was Inspector Dubois, who had become not only a professional contact, but a friend and mentor. "Priya, we have good news," he said. "The operation we carried out in Thailand based on information from the Thomas Klaus case rescued 17 women. Some had been missing for years. Your testimony was instrumental in locating this network." As she left the cafe in the snowy Berlin, Priya smiled for the first time in months without conscious effort. Her story had begun as a personal tragedy, but it had turned into a tool for systemic change. Thomas Weber had tried to destroy her life, but he had inadvertently created one of the most powerful voices in the fight against international human trafficking. The bride who never was had become the woman she was always meant to be.